Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Martin Andrews, and we still have some people who are coming in, so I'm going to keep frantically admitting them to the session. But I'm so glad to be joining you today. And I can see the chat is, everyone is sharing their names. That would be wonderful. Let's really use the chat during this session. And I am going to keep admitting. Great, we've got quite a few participants. That's really, really wonderful. I always look forward to social studies conferences because we get to meet the amazing social studies teachers that are out there. So this is the next best thing. So I'm really glad to be here with you today. I want to know, as you're sharing, why don't you share what your role is? Are you a elementary teacher, a high school teacher, a middle school teacher? Are you an administrator in higher ed? So write in the chat to everyone, just let us know who you are or what your role is. Yeah, great. And I always leave somebody off this list of this slide, so please just share. Lots of sixth grade, I see, in high school, seventh grade, elementary, wonderful. Yeah, a little bit about me. I was a middle school and high school social studies teacher in Ohio. I probably shouldn't admit to this crowd specifically that I was born and raised in Ohio and graduated from Ohio State University. Please don't hold that against me. And taught outside of Cincinnati social studies for about 7-8 years. It was right in 2001 when I started. And so a lot of changes were happening in the world of education then. No Child Left Behind was being passed. And life was changing a lot for social studies teachers, specifically lots of my colleagues in the elementary grades. Social studies was disappearing, and time for instruction for social studies was greatly reduced. And now I don't know if you feel it like I do, but there is a movement happening. Social studies is making a comeback. It's moving to the top of everyone's list, possibly because they're looking around and thinking about how important it is in a democracy to have a social studies community that is thriving. So I'm excited to be here with my people, you, and social studies teachers. What I want to say is, right now, I am still an educator, but I also work for a company called Inquire Ed, and we make social studies curriculum and professional development. And I'm not going to talk about that today. I do want to share one resource that I have for you. I made a virtual hub for this conference. And you can go there by going to that address, and I could probably chat that to you if I can find it. It's just inquireed.org/MCSS. And what we've got there is, I guess it's in lieu of the tchotchkes that you get at a conference. These are like virtual tchotchkes, I guess. So there's some Zoom backgrounds. There's a couple great videos that we made for the national conference that are really fun, that focus on social studies promotion. There's also a curriculum rubric in there that I will talk about a little bit later. So if you want to go and check that out, please do. Excuse me. But those are resources for you. So what I want to get is a sense of, since the chat is blowing up here, I want to get a sense of your comfortability. Can't see the slide too well. We're seeing your presenter view with a few different windows. Oh my gosh, you are? Oh, thank you so much. Someone just, let me go back and do, it must look chaotic then. Let me do a quick adjust. Thank you. I will, oh, there it is. How's that? Let me know if that's better. It should be like, no worries, we've all been there. Better, thank you. Yes, we are all very forgiving of Zoom faux pas, I think. I'd like to know, it still looks like gray squares. Let's see. Is that better, my chat people? You can adjust which slide is larger simply by moving your mouse between the presenter and the presenter share. I usually do this on a webinar. I should be presenting, let's see, let me double check. I apologize for this. Google Chrome, that's my tab. You know what I'm gonna do? I don't need that. Give me one sec. Let's go backwards first. Figure it out. I'm giving it all away right now. And I'm gonna go full view. How about this? View, present, full screen. This is gonna solve all the problems, right? Yeah, I hope that worked. I apologize. See the chat, that doesn't make any sense. Okay, well, I'll get back there. I want to know what your inquiry entry point is. My entry point to Zoom obviously is I'm maybe fairly new. Actually, I've been on it a lot. So in the chat right now, can you share a 1, 2, 3, or 4 for what your inquiry entry point is? Meaning, are you fairly new to inquiry-based social studies teaching? Have you experienced it as a learner, but haven't implemented much as a teacher? Maybe you have some experience with inquiry in your classroom, or maybe you feel very comfortable implementing inquiry in your classroom. Please share that with me and everyone else. Where are you on this inquiry spectrum? Because if you started teaching sometime around or before me or around the same time in 2001, we weren't talking about inquiry at that point. Inquiry is something that we really started to talk about in social studies about almost 10 years ago now, maybe. And with the introduction of the C3 framework specifically, and their focus on inquiry. And all of you have heard a lot about the C3 framework, I'm sure, and you know about the dimensions of the framework. That if you imagine when you are designing an inquiry unit for your classroom, you would want to design so that you are incorporating all the dimensions of the inquiry arc. Dimension 1, framing with questions, developing and planning your inquiries. Dimension 2, digging into geography and history and economics and civics and those disciplinary concepts and tools. Dimension 3 is happening all the time, evaluating sources and using evidence. And then dimension 4, taking informed action and communicating your conclusions. My contribution to this as well is to think about that is the framework of inquiry. What is happening in the classroom? What are students experiencing in an inquiry-based social studies class that they aren't experiencing in more traditional classrooms? Well, in an inquiry-based class, there is deep, active engagement in the investigations of social studies content. That means that it's not a sit and get. It's not someone dumping knowledge into me, fire hosing me with facts. It is deep and active engagement. And we're going to talk about what we mean by that. That there is responsive instruction, that you as a inquiry-based social studies teacher, that the students in front of you affect the way that you facilitate, that the instruction that you give depends upon the students in front of you. And students also experience productive struggle to discern meaning and address real world problems. Inquiry-based social studies is not easy. There is a whole world out there that misinterprets what inquiry-based education is, that it's students making up their own questions and doing their own things, that inquiry is rigorous and students are going to need to really dig in and engage in that productive struggle so that they can grow and that they can learn. And they do it because inquiry addresses real world problems. They can see their learning have an effect on the world. And we'll talk about that as well. What do they become? Well, they become resilient learners who can adapt to changing circumstances. They become engaged, informed, and socially responsible members of their communities, and critical consumers of information, goods, and services. And how important is that right now in the world? Critical consumers of information, goods, and services. So what I want to do now is take you through these 4 phases of using inquiry in social studies. And some of them will be very familiar to you who understand and know the C3 inquiry arc. Because the C3 inquiry arc is often used to design inquiries, and to design inquiries really at a high level. So when we're talking about bucketing content and standards, that's the first thing we'll look at, and drafting your unit questions, this is often what people engage in when they are writing curriculum. But we're also going to look at how then instructional materials are created from that design. And then finally, how we give students a continuous experience of investigation. We connect their learning and we deepen it. So we're going to dive right in. I'm afraid that if I bring up my chat, you're all going to see it, but I'm going to need to do that anyways, just to check in. Great. So bucketing content and standards. Most of you are probably familiar with this activity. You probably do it when you sit down and you design a unit for your students. So you get your standards. I looked up the Michigan standards, pretty familiar with them. I know that you just created them, in maybe 2018. There was a lot of controversy around it, just like there is in other states across the country. We exist as social studies teachers in a political sphere. And you are handed the standards, and then you are asked to teach them. So one of the ways that you start out is taking those standards and looking at unit design and starting to bucket them and saying, okay, I have a theme, I have a topic, and now how am I going to break these standards up into different content foci or focuses? And when you do that, when you even start to train your lens, because the standards are handed down to you, but then there's a lot of selection that you do when you decide where to focus. So it might be a standard related to the Revolutionary War, but you have some latitude about how you're investigating that. So this is a chance over and over again. You, in a sense, are really writing the story for students in a lot of ways by what you select. So here and every other place, when you make choices about what you put in front of students, to the best of your ability, reflect on how your own experience, your own bias affects the choices you make, and how you can avoid a single narrative. Growing up in the 80s and 90s, early 90s, received a single narrative in my social studies classes. And that single narrative wasn't questioned. And I tried when I became a social studies teacher to make sure that I wasn't telling a single narrative, one story, with what I selected or with how I approach the material with students. And that's something that I'm sure that you all strive to do as well. One thing that I didn't do enough when I was a social studies teacher, because we weren't collaborative in the places that I worked, is I didn't seek out others to give me feedback. And I feel like that is a really important part too. Sometimes in classrooms, we can be very siloed and we can be by ourselves, and we suffer as practitioners in that way. And I think our students, they miss out too, because we get to share our content with someone and they can give us feedback on it, just like we would want students to get feedback on their work. So we're bucketing the content of our unit, right? So let's imagine that I think fifth grade is the standards in Michigan. You have to deal with the Columbian exchange, colonization. So let's say that the 13 colonies, that's what the general content of your unit is. And then you look at the standards and you look and see, oh, well, they're talking about reasons for migration. They're talking about daily life, trade, and commerce. And they're talking about the growing independence of the colonies. So this is kind of like a structure for a unit. The next step is injecting the inquiry into this framework. And it becomes about drafting your unit's inquiry questions. And we know, those of us who are working in inquiry and trying to look at the C3 framework and have it help us design our units, that a unit is structured by a compelling question, and then it is investigated through supporting questions. And so I want to take what we just looked at, the 13 colonies and those buckets, and see if we can turn those into the framework for inquiry and framing them as questions. So first of all, that compelling question. What makes a great compelling question? If you want to fire up the chat with compelling questions, ideas about compelling questions, what makes a compelling question? How can you put a question out in the world to your students that make them want to go on an inquiry? I mean, that's the craft of designing a question. What is it? It is not closed-ended, obviously. It's open-ended. A little touch of controversy. I like that. A twist. It relates to their own lives. It doesn't have a simple answer. All of those. Great, great. Yes, absolutely. Open-ended and complex. No right answer. Gray morality. Messy. Yeah, not neat, not clean. Connects to the lived experiences of students. So something that they connect to. Something that isn't just a museum piece, but something that has an effect on them somehow, that they can see themselves in that question. Here's one that is really difficult sometimes, and we try to do this in our curriculum when we design an inquiry question, and it is very challenging. Can you somehow hide a call to action in your question? So how can we do this? How can we understand this so we can? And I want to look at an example of that, but it's challenging. But later on in the unit, when you want students to take action, this inquiry question is something that maybe can help you if you design it in the right way at the beginning. So let's take a look at the 13 colonies. All right, we're going to make the 13 colonies disappear. And we're going to ask this question. How can we help our community survive and thrive? Now, in there is hidden an action. Oh, there's got to be something we can do to help our community survive and thrive. Well, one of the things we can do is learn about how the communities at this time survived and how they thrived. So the question becomes, we are going to investigate the 13 colonies, the way that they work, so that we can better understand how communities survive and thrive. So maybe we can help our own survive and thrive, whether that's our school community, our classroom community, our larger community. Okay, so now we're going to go down to these 3 buckets, and we're going to see if we can turn those topics into supporting questions. The supporting question for migration, instead of today we're going to talk about migration, it's today we're going to think about, what if you left your homeland for the unknown? Why would you do that? What would you be worried about? What do you think they felt and they were worried about? Why do you think they left? Let's find out. Let's dig in. So just the flip from a subject that has no potential, that is basically closed in and of itself, to a question is a big shift. Instead of let's investigate trade and commerce, why do people in a community need each other? And then, well, what do they do to meet those needs? And who supplies those needs? Let's look at that in the 13 colonies. And finally, instead of growing independence or what can we do to gain independence? Suddenly that's a question that relates to my fifth graders that I'm teaching. Are you want to be more independent from your parents? What can you do to gain independence? What are conflicts that you have? That's what we're going to look at with the 13 colonies. So somehow these questions reach out and bring students into the inquiry. Now let me say, this is where most districts, most curriculum stops in a way. And maybe you agree with this, maybe you don't. Let me know in the chat. But a lot of times teachers get handed a curriculum, and it is standards turned into questions, turned into maybe some targets, but the day-to-day instructional moves, the instructional materials that you are using every day, so much of that is often left up to the teacher. And I don't know if others have had that experience, but that's what it was like for me. So I spent hours every week going online, looking for articles for students to read, trying to gather all the sources that I was going to use. And it's the biggest task, and it's the most time consuming. So I want to talk a little bit about it because it really has a lot of different aspects, but I want to break it down into gathering sources and designing tasks. So here was something that maybe you heard in your social studies experience. I know I did. When I was in my methods classes, I was told, you know, Martin, when you're a social studies teacher, you can't be the sage on the stage. You have to be anyone want to finish that in the chat? The guide on the side, right? You need to step back and let students learn. And I wanted to do that, but I didn't know what that meant at the earliest part of my career. I think I heard that. I go, okay, I can't be up in front of the class talking and lecturing. I know that. So then what are students learning from, if not me? Are they learning from the textbook? Because the textbook I have is 8 years old and it keeps saying things like, in the year 2000, when these things happen, and it was already 2004. So my intuition told me that it wasn't the textbook that they would be learning from. And it's actually not one source, me, or the textbook. I came to realize that it's a lot of sources, that throughout the unit, they are looking at so many sources, and I'm responsible for gathering all those maps, those photographs, those paintings, those songs, all of those things that they're going to investigate. I need to gather and bring into them. And then I need to design a task for them to interact with that source. So every lesson I design probably has a source at the center, map, photograph, video, something, and then a protocol, the way that students are learning from that source. And my job as a teacher on the side is to move them one way or the other, help them when they get stuck, give them more tools to learn from that source. It was a big shift in my thinking, but it also made my job a lot harder in many ways, because I had to go out and gather those sources and design those tasks in a whole new way. So I'm going to give you some ideas to think about when you're gathering sources. And I'm also going to give you a couple tools that you can use to kind of evaluate your sources as they come in. You're probably good at this already. You have to be as a teacher. There are so many bad sources out there. And in today's world, some of them are so excellent, like they're so good at making themselves seem like good sources. So we have to be really careful when we're out in the world and we're looking for sources for our classroom. You got to train your lens. develop your critical eye. Sam Weinberg talks about how we want our students to laterally read. Talks about how when we go to a web page and we look at a source, we immediately open 4 tabs on each side to figure out who's saying this, what are they saying, what do they want, before we even read the source. So you have to develop your critical eye. I have to develop my critical eye so that we make sure we're bringing in front of students things that are accurate, things that are representative. So define your purpose when you're out searching for a source, and commit to diverse representation. I mean that I have an experience and I'm going to tend to tell a story from my experience. Just know that that's limiting. So look for diverse representation in sources from different voices, different people, whether that is different racial groups, different ethnic groups, different men and women, and a range of people that are coming in and that are given voice in the sources that you pick. As you search, follow protocols. And I'm going to give you some of those: accuracy, authority, objectivity, currency, coverage. Make sure that you are looking out for those qualities. Mix it up. A mix of primary and secondary sources, different genres, different media. If you think about if the same kinds of sources over and over again, then we know that that isn't going to reach all of our students. It's an issue of sort of differentiating for all learners as well. And here's an idea: stray from the kids menu. I don't know how many of you have found yourself like looking through lots and lots of social studies for kids sites. I have, and every once in a while I'll remember, there was a great little bit of a podcast that I heard that kids would understand, that they would appreciate. There's a little bit of this, there's a little bit of things that I connect to in my experience that are perfectly appropriate for my students, that I can stray from the kids menu, and then I can start to bring in things that they will find interesting and engaging as sources that are not specifically leveled to their age. Finally, once you've gathered these sources, adapt them, frame them, and modify them to meet the needs of your students. Don't throw something away just because it's not a perfect fit. Adapt it. Audit it is important. Seek out other people, specifically on topics that you feel like, oh, do I have a grasp on this topic? Do I feel like I can speak with authority on this topic? Does this source speak with authority? Ask someone else. It's so much easier when you do it as a community. What I want to do right now is pull up my, you're probably going to see some notes and things like that. So I want to share something with you really quickly. I think I'm back. I'm going to give you 2 resources that I find help me, and we've created them both. They're just short source checklists. So one of them is part of a larger curriculum rubric that goes through different types of sources. And another one is a quick source checkup checklist. Oh, I think I sent something to just one person. Oh, there you go. Everyone. We try that again. So Matt, you're going to get this twice. So these are just 2 resources that you could use to help you do a source checkup. And I'd be glad, like, if anyone has any other source checkup checklists that they want to share, chat them in the chat, and we'll share them with everybody. So you've designed your framed your inquiry, and you've gathered your sources, a massive undertaking. Now you have to ask yourself, how are students going to interact with these sources? What are their inquiry-based learning tasks? What are they, and how are they student-led and teacher-facilitated whenever possible? So how can I get my students interacting with that and me stepping back and letting that happen? and only being there when they need me? How can I design multiple tasks within each lesson? So how can I introduce my students to the subject with a See, Think, Wonder protocol, and then dig in to the investigation with a jigsaw group activity or something like that? So how do I have multiple inquiry-based learning tasks in a single lesson? And how do these tasks work together to move the inquiry process forward? I'm going to stop right now and see if, hope this doesn't mess everything up. But I'm going to go to not full screen, and I'm going to take you over to Project Zero. And I hope that many of you are familiar with Project Zero. I had this in my chat list. I'm going to go to this thinking routine toolbox. This is one of the most amazing resources I ever came about, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. What this is just an amazing collection of inquiry-based learning protocols. See, Think, Wonders, Think, Pair, Shares, Connect, Extend, Challenge. So these are core thinking routines that students can use to interact and learn from a source. And digging deeper into ideas, exploring ideas. These are amazing resources. And I would suggest, if you haven't explored this, go do it, because it can really give you the specific tools that you need to make sure that your tasks are student-led and teacher facilitated, that they can be contained within each lesson. So those ones that I just shared with you are specific classroom tested protocols, and that you can embed across lessons, that you can encourage students to explore that content in collaboration with their peers. And they support all kinds of moments in the inquiry classroom: questioning, brainstorming, gathering and responding to evidence, discussing and sharing out. So really it's that triangulation that you're trying to do between you on the side, the student, and the source. And that is part of what the inquiry-based learning teacher's job is. So finally, I want to know, how are we going to connect all of these parts into something that feels like a full experience? So I want to go back to this. We have our structure of inquiry, right? We have our compelling question and our supporting questions. And underneath that, I have gathered tasks and sources, and I've created lessons that go underneath each supporting question. And the way that I'm connecting those lessons across a unit, across these supporting questions, is I'm engaging in reflection activities. I'm using a unit-long display. How many people use those, or anchor charts, or bulletin boards, or wonder walls? I'm keeping students in this inquiry and connecting these lessons together, because that's an important thing to realize, is that no one does inquiry-based social studies just in a lesson, because a lesson can't be long enough for that deep investigation that students need to do. It happens over the course of a unit as lessons connect to each other. So what we're missing from this experience are the bookends, because we haven't talked about how we begin the experience and how the experience ends. And those are really important. Those are the last two things I want to talk about. And how you launch this unit, and then how you take a moment after that last supporting question to ask students what you've learned and how you're going to use that to take an action. So launching your unit. There's a great, Lowenstein has this really great breakdown of how you prime the brain for activation. And that's what you're doing when you're launching a unit. And the way that you do that is you create a gap between the known and the unknown. You can't prime curiosity by just sharing things that people don't know. But if they know a little bit, and there's a gap between what they know and what they don't know, that's when curiosity happens. That's when your inquiry question is activated. That curiosity is the drive to close the gap between the known and the unknown. And the most important factor in launching a unit, in creating a great hook, is that if I'm overwhelmed by information, I'm not going to be hooked. But if I find the right amount of information to give a student, to just entice them in the right way, then I can hook them into the inquiry. And that's what a hook lesson should do at the beginning of a unit. And actually, this can be, for those of you who liked being the sage on the stage, the hook lesson can still be that time for you to tell an amazing story. That's one way a hook lesson can happen. Another way could be an immersive experience, a simulation, a game. However it is, this is where you have a chance to hook students in, and it shouldn't require you to pre-teach at all. It should be able to meet the students where they are. They don't require any formal knowledge, maybe connects to their experiences, their knowledge and skills. And it ends this hook lesson with the presentation of the compelling question. Here it's called an inquiry question, but the compelling question. It's the ta-da at the end of the hook lesson. Here it is. Here's what we're going to be talking about in our unit. The launch, here's a suggestion for launching a unit 2, is that students need to generate questions that they're curious about over the course of an inquiry. You might already have designed your supporting questions because you had to bucket your content, and then you wanted a question that that summed up that content, and you might have the questions all laid out, and that's fine. But to get students to generate their own questions, to lay alongside of those questions, it's a really powerful thing. And we use the question formulation technique a lot to do that, to get students generating investigation questions. That's a protocol developed by the Right Question Institute. You can Google them. It's an amazing technique, but there are a lot of ways that you can get students generating questions in this launch of your unit. And then take their questions and don't throw them away. Don't file them away that never look at them. Put them on the walls and use them as prompts. Sometime during the unit when you need an exit ticket or when you need a beginning investigation, pull one of their questions down that you haven't talked about and say, is there anything that we know about this now? Why don't you write for a little bit about this? So generating those questions and then reflecting on them during the unit are going to keep them hooked. Then you go through your investigation of content, right? You go through your supporting questions, and you're at that point where you're ready to take action. And this is a part where people sometimes it becomes difficult. Like, well, how do I take action? What do you expect me to do with my students? Does everything need to be a big project? Do I need to get overwhelmed? The answer is no. All you need to do is find one way that what you have worked on in the unit has an effect or a repercussion in the outside world, outside of your classroom. That's what I think informed action is. They could write an essay and it could be informed action, but they need to do something with that essay. They need to present it to someone. They need to post it somewhere. They need to share it in some way. What needs to happen is that whatever they do develops out of the inquiry and it connects to their experience, and that it has to be about more than a grade. And I think that's the unique position of the social studies, because what we are studying is what it means to be human. And what we are studying is what makes the world work or not work in our culture and our democracy. So there are so many ways that what students are learning in your classes can have a direct effect on the outside world. And I'm going to give you some examples here in a second. And that idea of sharing with a public audience outside the classroom, it could be a buddy class down the hallway. It doesn't have to be a huge event that you put on, but it lets them know that they were informed about something. They learned about something and built this knowledge. And now that knowledge has a purpose. And that validates the learning. Create a challenge when you are getting ready to take action. Design a lesson that reviews the key learnings of the units, reflect on that compelling question, and then maybe make a statement. We do that in our work. We have students create basically a mission statement for what they want to do. We call it an inquiry challenge statement, but they say, we're gonna take our learning and we're gonna do this with it so that we affect this audience or that we make this change. And then once you create that mission statement, you can use a design cycle to help students develop their conclusions. Don't send them away and have them work on a project, an informed action project outside of class. Spend the time in class, 2 days, 3 days, however long it takes you, maybe longer, to work on that in class, give feedback throughout the course of it, and choose what's right for you and what connects with your community. I'm going to give you 2 examples, and I know I'm running out of time here, so I don't want to go without giving you some examples. So here's a second grade example of a group of second graders who were using our curriculum and coming up with this on their own. So the question that frames this unit for second graders is, how can we help our community work together to meet its needs and wants? It's an economic heavy unit when they're talking about needs and wants and producers and consumers. And throughout the course of the inquiry, the supporting questions are, why can't we have everything we want? A great question for a second grader. How do businesses meet needs and wants? How do we make choices when we're spending money? And how does a community meet our collective needs? When they had done all their work in the unit, they got to that point and they said, okay, what do we want to do? And there was a brainstorming session and much yelling and writing down, and things were done. And they came up with an inquiry challenge statement that said they would create and present a persuasive ad to tell about our blacktop playground in order to influence our principal and PTO to change the blacktop to be more safe and fun. And this is the chart paper that they used to write it. There's a formula that they used to make sure that it was simply written and that it had those strong active verbs. And sure enough, they went to the PTO and they presented their arguments, and they got to watch later on out their window as their blacktop was redone, and such a sense of accomplishment they felt. And that was one way. A more complicated way to take action. They needed to set up, the teacher had to set up the meeting with the PTO. They had to work toward it, but the teacher really wanted to invest in that. Another example is from a 5th grade unit. I'm going to have the image come up first this time. So this was their statement. We will create a presentation to persuade our librarian to update books in the library that misrepresent Native American peoples and cultures. So there you see some books there, and they have a review sheet they created. Their compelling question for this was, how can we better understand the cultural heritage of this land? So it was a unit in 5th grade that looked at Native America, past and present. And their supporting question, what was life like for historic Native American cultures? What can stories teach us about people and cultures? How can artifacts teach us about the past? And can we know the whole story behind an historical event? Now, the teacher knew they were going to do a presentation. They knew that was part of the informed action, but she left it open for the students to really talk in 5th grade. Like, what do we want to do? And they had complained to her that the books in the library weren't saying the things that they were learning right now, because the books were 20 years old, and either the scholarship had changed, or these books just weren't written well, or things that phrases and terms that you would use 20 years ago weren't the phrases and terms that we would use right now. And the students were passionate about that. They said, we should get updated books, or we should put in a little note in that says that this piece of information is incorrect. And so the idea for the focus of the presentation came from the students. And this was if you think about it, it's a rather easy task to undertake. They just walked to the library, they reviewed these books, they worked in groups. But when they presented to their librarian and their principal, and then the librarian said, I'm going to take in what you say into consideration, and they saw those books different books started to appear, and the librarian came back and said, I just got this new book and I wanted to share it with you. All of a sudden, my learning had an influence on the world. And that's what a well-designed inquiry unit can do. A well-designed inquiry unit can give students the ideas that they can affect change, that learning matters, that the process matters, that they actually learn by doing, that it can be joyful and exciting, that knowledge matters, that they should act based on information. If we all did that, we'd be better off. And that in the process of inquiry, lots of mistakes are going to happen and they have to move on. So I have time for some questions, and that's 4 minutes. But I'm just interested to hear maybe if anyone has done, oh, thank you. And the Project Zero website was shared. If anyone wants to share just a general reflection about maybe a informed action project that you did with your students that you want to share in the last couple of minutes, I'd be curious to hear about that. What is something where students took specifically what they learned in your social studies class and used that information to take action in the world? I'd be curious to hear if anyone wants to share with that in the chat. But otherwise, we're basically done here. And if anyone has any questions they want to ask, you can do that in the chat as well. And I know that you're going to be, I'm a little nervous about going over time. So will we have access to your PowerPoints? Absolutely. You know what I will do is on that page that I gave you, the inquired.org/MCSS, Michigan Council for the Social Studies. I'm going to go in right after this. I'm going to do some web wizardry, and I will embed the presentation there. So it will be there for you. Hey, I hope you all have a great rest of the conference. And I just, I really appreciate you being there in the classroom every day. And I think you're saving democracy. So keep doing it and take care.